How America was stolen, 1492 to 1600. Before Columbus arrived in 1492, an estimated 60 million indigenous people lived across the Americas. Within a century, their population had plummeted by nearly 90% due to war, disease, and forced displacement. The land we now call America wasn't just discovered, it was taken, piece by piece. But how did it happen? And who paid the price? The story of America's colonization is often told from the perspective of explorers, pioneers, and European settlers. But the reality is much darker. From 1492 to 1600, European nations began carving up the New World, bringing with them disease, war, slavery, and cultural destruction that would forever alter the indigenous way of life. What started as exploration quickly became conquest. Lands that had been home to thriving civilizations for thousands of years were taken, repurposed, and claimed under European rule. Today, we're uncovering the real story of how America was stolen, the devastating impact on indigenous people, and the key moments that changed history forever. The European invasion, disease, displacement, and war. For Native Americans, European arrival meant one thing: catastrophe. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he didn't find an empty land. He found thriving civilizations with advanced trade networks, agriculture, and cities larger than many in Europe. The indigenous people of the Americas had their own governments, cultures, and histories stretching back thousands of years. But they were completely unprepared for what came next. Number 1. Diseases wiped out entire populations. Europeans carried smallpox, measles, and influenza, diseases that Native Americans had never encountered. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the indigenous population died within the first century after contact. Number 2. Forced labor and slavery devastated communities. Columbus and his men enslaved indigenous people, forcing them to mine for gold and work under brutal conditions. The encomienda system, established by the Spanish, gave colonists control over indigenous lands and people, turning them into forced laborers. Number 3. Displacement shattered entire cultures. As European powers claimed land, indigenous people were forced from their homes, killed, or pushed into servitude. The arrival of Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English colonists in the late 1500s set the stage for centuries of indigenous resistance and conflict. For Native Americans, the arrival of Europeans wasn't just colonization, it was an apocalypse. The key events that changed everything. The European takeover of the Americas didn't happen overnight. It was a series of calculated moves, betrayals, and violent conquests that unfolded over the course of the 16th century. Number 1. Columbus and the beginning of exploitation, 1492 to 1504. After landing in the Caribbean, Columbus immediately enslaved local Taino people, forcing them to mine gold. His men cut off hands, burned villages, and massacred those who resisted. By 1550, the Taino population had dropped from millions to fewer than 500 due to disease, forced labor, and executions. Number 2. Hernán Cortés and the fall of the Aztec Empire, 1519 to 1521. The Aztecs, led by Montezuma, ruled over millions in what is now Mexico. When Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived, he used deception, alliances with rival tribes, and superior weaponry to overthrow the empire. In 1521, after months of siege and disease outbreaks, the once mighty Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan fell, marking one of the most brutal conquests in history. Number 3. The Spanish expansion and the encomienda system, 1500s to 1600s. As Spain took control of vast territories, they forced Native Americans into a brutal system of labor. Indigenous people were stripped of their land, religion, and freedom. Spanish priests and officials tried to justify these actions, calling it civilizing the indigenous people, but in reality, it was enslavement. Number 4. The arrival of other European powers, late 1500s. By the late 1500s, the English, French, and Dutch had entered the race for the New World. Colonies like St. Augustine, 1565, and Jamestown, 1607, were founded, expanding European control further. Indigenous tribes fought back, but they faced an enemy with guns, steel, and growing numbers of settlers. By the dawn of the 1600s, the fate of Native Americans was already sealed. The land was being divided, claimed, and reshaped by European powers, and indigenous civilizations would never be the same again. Perhaps the most defining moment in the theft of America was the introduction of the encomienda system. This system, enforced by the Spanish crown, allowed European settlers to claim vast territories and force indigenous people into servitude. They worked in gold and silver mines, which made Spain the wealthiest empire in the world. They were forced to abandon their religions, adopt European customs, and work under brutal conditions. Entire cultures were wiped out in just a few generations. By the time 1600 arrived, the map of the New World was no longer defined by Native American nations. It was redrawn by European conquest. The indigenous people who remained were forced to either fight back, flee, or assimilate into a system designed to erase them. The 16th century was the beginning of centuries of oppression, forced removals, and resistance that Native Americans would face. Millions of lives were lost. Ancient cultures were erased. Lands that had been home to indigenous people for thousands of years were stolen. Today, we still feel the effects of this history, from ongoing fights for indigenous rights to historical myths that erase the reality of colonization. The story of how America was stolen isn't just about the past. It's about acknowledging the truth and ensuring history is told from all perspectives. What do you think? Should the history of America's colonization be told differently? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you're interested in uncovering more hidden truths from history, check out our next video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore history with us. Thanks for watching.